Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining from. We have got a great topic today, so buckle up. So, if this is your first time joining us, my name is Jason Brand. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. And Supply Chain Solutions, or SCS, as we call ourselves, is an end-to-end logistics and transportation provider. So we handle every single part of your shipment from origin to destination and everything in between. And it's been a really big year of restructuring and expansion really throughout the market. So despite the weaker economy too, which has been actually very challenging, but if you find yourselves kind of in that same situation where you're kind of trying to get a better idea of what your company looks like into the future and setting up some long-term goals, it's a great time to look at transportation. We love doing that with companies. It's kind of our, really what we started out doing, started out as a consulting company. So make sure you reach out to us. We'd love to kind of walk you through a process and maybe whiteboard, what some changes could look like. Anyways, as I mentioned earlier, we have a massive topic today. So let's try to get this show on the road. Today, we're going to be breaking down the state of the LTL, or less than truckload market, in 2024. And this is going to be through the lens of 3 different quarterly earnings calls. So we're going to run through TFI International, we're going to run through Saia, and we're going to run through Knight-Swift, because what I found extremely interesting is they are all telling a pretty similar story. And I hate to have this. Today's episode is going to be very fact and figure heavy. I'm going to do my very best to help emphasize those facts and figures in a way so you can kind of catch the important parts. I don't expect you to remember all of that stuff, but quite frankly, there is a really nice narrative that it's told through these earnings calls, and these facts and figures add to it. I tried to trim some that just were helpful, but overall not needed, to make it as simple as possible. But, if you do have a pen and paper, for sure, you can write some of the stuff down. Really the big takeaways are really what's key here. So let's dive in and let's just answer the show's title right off the bat. So in 2024, the state of the LTL market, it could really be characterized as being in a state of aggressive expansion. Nearly all of the major carriers are in this mode, and this is despite the challenging freight market and rising operational costs. So companies like TFI International, Saia, and Knight-Swift, they're all investing heavily in infrastructure this year, and the goal is driving long-term value and profitability. So what is interesting about what they're doing is they're missing some major financial targets. They're facing some pretty substantial short-term margin squeezes and some pretty massive operational inefficiencies. And you know what? What's great about all these earnings calls is all of the companies have made it clear in their own way that these expansion efforts are critical for their future growth and their market positioning. And, really, what they could have done is just said, hey, we're swapping our profitability targets out for our cost management goals and making sure we keep a stable pricing environment. And that's what we're going to do this year. Essentially, they all said that, but they kind of just beat around the bush and said, those targets we talked about, what the analyst said we should do? Scratch that. And it's not like they didn't have expansion plans for a while, but there's been some lofty goals, and the freight market has really not been in place the way it was expected to be to support those goals. Yet, all of these companies had different strategies, and actually they're all doing, despite some of the challenges I just mentioned, they're doing okay. So let's get into some of the dense stuff here. We're going to start with the TFI earnings call first. So TFI International, it was their second quarter earnings call, obviously. It was led solely by their CEO, Elaine Bedard. This is actually relatively unique, and it focused heavily on the company's LTL operations, or less than truckload, in the US. Now, there's good reason for this, because that accounted for 42% of the company's revenue. So the operating ratio for their US LTL segment was at 90.8%, which was a slight improvement from the previous year. Previous year, they were at 91.5%. But the problem here is it's still pretty far off from their ambitious target of getting it down to an 88% before the end of the year. So the CEO, Alan, was pretty blunt about this and said, that goal is completely, I think he said the words, that goal is impossible, and we have a different goal. And that goal was to be below 90% before the end of the year. So he pretty much made that clear. That's his target. They're relatively close. They're at 90.8%, obviously. So they went down less than a percentage point over the course of a year. But, they can still make it. We're going to watch and see. I'm very interested in that. Now, if we look at volume, TFI's LTL shipments, they slightly decreased. So they came into at 1.46 million in the second quarter, and that's down from a 1.5 million in the previous year. So this did emphasize that goal I mentioned earlier, where they need to focus on cutting costs and improving efficiency. So Elaine, he used this as an opportunity to highlight these inefficiencies, these cost inefficiencies within their US operations compared to their more efficient Canadian operations. In Canada, their operating ratio is actually below 80%. And as a reminder, 90.8%, 90.8% is their US operations average in LTL. So he did attribute these differences in efficiencies to the high costs that were inherited from the acquisition of UPS Freight. As a reminder, that has been rebranded. It's T-Force Freight. That happened back in 2021. And to tackle these inefficiencies, Elaine did point out that, they need better financial management, and that needs to be specifically at the terminal level. Also, he emphasized that they need to increase the weight of their shipments. And so they need to shift their customer focus from the retail sector to industrial freight. An interesting thing that came up pretty frequently, which you can imagine, is he did note that the demise of Yellow Corp, it hadn't significantly boosted their volumes. And it kind of left the company still struggling with shipment volume growth. But the company still is growing in general. Hang on one second. So TFI, they've gone through numerous acquisitions since the second quarter of 2023. That's included companies like Deseki International, Hercules Forwarding, Entrepassage Marco, Vetter Transportation, and JHT Holdings. So these expansions, they've contributed to a total of 26.6% as far as an increase in revenue goes. Their total revenue, and this is actually including fuel, has rose to 2.26 billion. That's up from 1.79 billion. So as a reminder, despite this growth in revenue, TFI did acknowledge that these increases were almost entirely due to acquisitions rather than market conditions. And he did go on to call out a very weak state of the transportation environment, and also mentioned that, they didn't have their fuel surcharge rates, which they wanted, and it's been dragging their numbers down overall. So when we get into the financial performance realm, TFI's LTL business posted an operating margin of 13.8%, while truckload and logistics reported margins of 16.1% and 9.1%. So the truckload segment had the highest earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, or your EBITDA margin for short. I came in at 22.4%. And then you can compare that to the 20.7% that was LTL and the 14.8% that was logistics. When you look at the adjusted total EBITDA, it rose to 380.1 million. That's up from 300 million. And their operating income increased to 208.1 million, which was up from 192.4 million. Now, all of this sounds great. Obviously, we just discussed they had a series of acquisitions that basically rose to a quarter increase in their revenue. But this is kind of where you see the fragility of the market. And when you take a look at their earnings per share, it declined from a 1.47 to a 1.38. So you kind of can see what's happening there in the more fragile state of the market's reflection in that number as well. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's go over to Saia. And quite frankly, it is a similar story. And that's actually what I like about these three companies. And they're actually, it did go beyond these three companies, but these were a great three to focus on. So during its second quarter, Saia experienced this significant challenge, just like TF did. And they were going through this massive expansion of their national network. It dramatically impacted their financial results. And it did so much so that it freaked out their shareholders. They had a 20% drop in their stock price. Thankfully, that rebounded. But still, just the company going maybe a different direction than the stockholders liked. Now, their operating costs from the added terminals and the new operating costs from the added terminals and a shift to lower weight retail freight, sound familiar? It negatively impacted their margins, which makes sense. But despite all these challenges, Saia still was able to report a 12% year-over-year increase in earnings per share, bringing them up to 3.83. Now, that sounds kind of different, but here is the little caveat to that. They were on expectation, or it was basically viewed that they should be 4% higher than that point. So while it was still a 12% increase, it was 4% short of what analysts were saying should have happened. Revenue wise, Saia grew by 19% year over year to 823 million, which was driven by a 10% increase in tonnage and an 8% increase in revenue per hundredweight. Saia's tonnage actually saw some great growth. You saw these increases of 7.6% in April, 9.8% in May, 12.2% in June. But what's even crazier is these increases could have been higher. What's funny is that last year was actually a tough comparison point, since the yellow process of shippers kind of leaving the company was already happening during this period. So they were already seeing elevated volumes last year at this point, which is pretty cool. Now, the operating ratio for Saia overall, it came in at 83.3% for this quarter, and that was a 60 basis point increase year over year. Now, this is where it gets fascinating. If you look at the new terminals specifically, that means terminals that have come online in the past 3 years, that operating ratio was substantially higher. It was sitting all the way up at a 95%. And if you look at the older terminals, they enjoyed this average ratio of an 82.2%. So Saia opened 8 new terminals in the second quarter. It contributed to a 130 basis point increase in their operating ratio, and, obviously OR operating ratio. Now, they did blame these massive increases on, really unforeseen but associated costs with opening these new facilities. Saia management, they consistently acknowledged that, obviously these costs are higher. Obviously these operating ratios aren't where we want them, but, it is our goal for growth. And they emphasized that they're still going to be adding 10 to 13 new locations before the end of the year. And they want to bring their expected terminals up to a total of 214 before they enter 2025, which is awesome. Now, beyond the increased operating ratios, their expenses rose as well. So salaries, wages, benefits, as well as their purchase transportation costs, they increased by around 30 basis points year over year. They saw a 19% increase in headcount to support all the new volume they were experiencing, and they implemented an annual wage increase that averaged right around 4.1%. So a lot of cost pressures that did pull up their 2024 operating ratios as well. And, really their guidance. So now they're expecting, when you kind of add all that together, pretty much a flat year as a result. But as you can imagine, management chimed in again and say, wait. This is part of our goal. We made this very, very clear. And hey, this expansion, it involves this brand new target, which you're going to love, shareholders, of achieving an 100 to 200 basis point of op ratio improvement annually after we get to the point we want to be. Oh yeah, that's great and all. But remember, we still are using this $1 billion capital expenditure program throughout 2024 to keep buying real estate. It was beyond that, though. It was stated for real estate, for equipment, and then also IT expenditures as well. So, they kind of hung that shiny carrot of like, we're going to have these great results later, but now it's going to hurt, which, happens occasionally. Now, these aren't the only companies. So we've got other LTL carriers like Knight-Swift Transportation Holdings. They're also aggressively expanding. They actually opened 11 new locations just in the last quarter, and they're also planning on opening 20 more by the year end. Knight-Swift LTL, their revenue rose by 15.1% year over year, and their shipments per day increased by 8.4%. And, as you can expect, the same situation with the other companies as well. They saw in the short term a pretty temporary dip, but substantial dip in their margins. And, they attributed it to the same things, the costs of setting up those facilities and the associated operational inefficiencies that came with, taking a new facility online. Now, TFI, Saia, Knight-Swift, they've all been aggressively expanding this year, but it's not only them. Actually, we've got XPO opening new terminals, expanding. Estes Express lines. You've even got regional carriers getting into the mix. Good example is A. Dewey Pyle. They're also opening new terminals as well. So, I think that most interesting thing here is financially across the board, these companies are spread very thin at the moment, and they're really trying to create efficiency as they expand, which is pretty much a double-edged sword. But what's happened is, despite all this new capacity in the market, we've had this remarkably stable pricing. And, I think that would suggest, hey, maybe there's more volume in the market. Maybe that's kind of what's holding these prices stable. And on all of the calls, what was made abundantly clear is that there is less volume than there was prior to Yellow's demise. So the market is still a weaker place. But with the general consensus of expansion in the LTL market, one of the goals of almost all of these companies is we need to keep our where we're at tight, right? We need to keep prices as stable as possible. We can't sacrifice any more margin at this point because simply we are in a spending state. So that, but it still has been remarkable that pricing has been so stable despite all of this. So what is the takeaway here? And I think the biggest takeaway is, what are you doing when you're shipping LTL right now? Have you been doing that for 5+ years? Because if you have, the state of the market is in such a transformational moment. It's definitely a time to see, are there better options out there? Yes, it's not the greatest negotiation point, but there are plenty of reasons why some of these companies would still negotiate with you. Saia made it very clear they were not volume chasing. They needed quality margin. But that being said, that's on their call with their shareholders, and they don't want to look like the next Yellow, so to speak. And buying up so many of those Yellow facilities, that is a little concerning. So it is definitely a time to take a look at how you're shipping an LTL. It is an interesting year for LTL. This expansion, seeing it across the board, is very exciting. And really going into 2025, we should be set up for a very, very just powerful LTL market in general. Good service, pretty competitive rates, hopefully. And if we can bring that volume back, it should be very stable as well. Anyways, I really appreciate you guys for joining. I know this was very, very fact and figure heavy. I hope the narrative was pretty clear. But yeah, drop a comment, drop a like. Let me know, what your takeaways are on this as well. Hey, thanks so much.